The challenges of economic reforms. First, I'm going to talk about what is economic reforms. In simple terms, economic reform is a continual process of changing policies and methods of implementation to improve state service delivery and to build more inclusive and participatory institutions in an economy where people can freely pursue their business idea. Society constantly changes, as do their demands and preferences. Likewise, ways of doing business also change with scientific innovation, growing competition, and globalization. As a result, government constantly need to revisit their policies and make necessary changes in order to ensure that their economy and product remains competitive on both domestic and the global markets, and service delivery remains effective. This ever-changing public process is collectively known as economic reform. Economic reforms as a movement towards greater freedom. The fundamental objectives of economic reform is to create both greater space for the private entrepreneurs and to limit state's role as a regulator that works closely with the stakeholder and the civil society to bring out good policies and ensure their effective implementation. Private entrepreneurs are proven to be far more efficient in doing business than the state itself. By creating conducive and attractive environment for the private investment, government provides space for the entrepreneurs to create new jobs, which therefore enhances national output. Economic output is enhanced when a vibrant private sector comes together with dynamic and sound investment-friendly policies. State must guarantee nominal level of state interventions and equal playing field for all the economic players. In this process, government compete with each other in the regional and the global markets to attract interests of private sectors, ultimately leading to greater economic freedom. However, broader political reforms that allows greater participation of stakeholders and civil society right from the formulation to the implementation of policy to ensure broad-based ownership of the reforms is the most important condition for the meaningful progress towards economic reforms and its sustainability. The need to change effective and corruption-beating policies. While having ineffective and corruption-beating policies is better than having no policy at all, the importance of establishing transparent and accountable process is crucial to ensure the success of economic reforms. When new policy contradicts with the interests of a powerful elite class, it soon becomes difficult to implement reform as the elite class use their influence to block reforms. As you can see, corrupt policies quickly becomes a slippery slope from which return is a long and uphill battle. Policies that harbors or encourage corruption are the number one enemy of the free and the fair market competition. And as long as such policy exists in an economy, a vibrant and the fully competitive market can never be achieved. So, the initial reform should be focused on replacing unsound policies. However, it is always a difficult task to overcome a powerful resistance coming from the elite classes. So, now I'm going to talk about when are the reforms initiated. Broadly speaking, there are four major factors that compels a government of a state to undertake economic reform. First, major political change takes place. Economic reform is commonly a high priority when the popular people's uprising topple autocratic or totalitarian regime and establishes democracy. The people's increased awareness after such a political change exerts tremendous pressure on the new government to differentiate itself from the previous regime. They expect to see a change in their economic status immediately after a dynamic political change. In this scenario, a transitional government or the government that is formed after election has no option than to introduce massive reforms to address people's desire for change and to ensure its political survival. For example, Central Europe initiated massive economic reforms after the fall of communism in 1990. The second, political parties with a strong reform agenda are voted to power. This is the most desirable and ideal scenario for initiating economic reforms. In South Asian experience, the real economic reform takes place when a party with a strong mandate for reform is voted to power. Massive and comprehensive reform can only take place when a general election brings to power a majority government that strongly favors reforms. Like India initiated massive economic reforms after the Congress with a strong reform agenda was voted to power in early 90s, and Nepal had a similar experience when Nepali Congress won the majority in 1992 elections. The third, sudden and unexpected economic crisis. This is the most common case wherein a government is forced to initiate economic reforms. Massive economic reforms like the Mexican economic crisis of 1994 and the East Asian financial crisis of 1997 compelled government to seek emergency assistance from multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. The assistance awarded by the multinational organization come along with a number of conditional policy reforms. This external pressure for the reform is able to transcend any existing political resistance by offering a choice between the bankruptcy and reforms. The fourth, advocacy by the civil society groups. This is another powerful and important tool for initiating economic reforms, particularly during the period of political stability. Civil society collaborate with the Independent Business House, Chamber of Commerce, and economic think tanks to advocate policy solutions that can benefit the country. With such lobby, they can peacefully bring to the government attention that how weak rule of law is discouraging investments, how opaque public procurement is breeding corruption and poor service delivery, and how weak corporate governance is inflating the cost of goods and services, thus by making domestic products uncompetitive in the global markets. Now I'm going to talk about the resistance to economic reforms and their reasons. The first, political resistance. Political resistance is one of the most and the major challenge that economic reforms generally face in the developing countries. It is virtually impossible to initiate economic reforms as long as political resistance, particularly in the ruling party or the government, persists. Because of this resistance, political leaders don't listen or discard the voices raised by the civil society for reforms, or responsible leaders are tactfully prevented from coming close to those who advocate reforms. As a result, majority of the leaders who can influence the state policy are prevented from understanding what is the meaning of reforms and why such reforms are necessary to accelerate the development process of the country. Even if some leaders come to understand the importance of reforms, the number will not be enough to effectively challenge the wishes of the majority of the leaders. An important factor behind the political resistance to economic reforms is leaders' unwillingness or lack of courage to take risks. Since risk is an inbuilt component of any reform initiative, policy leaders generally try to avoid the risks by delaying implementation of the reform initiative, if not avoiding the reform together. Generally, this happens when the leaders are compelled to initiate reforms due to one or another reasons, but are not personally convinced about their necessity and likely outcomes, or they realize that the long-term benefits of reform may require unpopular moves in the short term, for instance, reducing some undesirable welfare benefits. This scenario is most likely when reforms are externally imposed, as in the case of conditional donor aid. Therefore, it suffers from a lack of domestic ownership. In such cases, there is a high chances of reversal or inaction of such reform initiative should radical party is voted to power or donors withdraw their support from a specific reform projects. Special interest group. The resistance coming from the special interest group exists due to inability or unwillingness of political leaders to act against the interests of financially powerful and politically influential elite class who benefits from the status quo. This elite class maintains a close relation with the influential politicians by regularly funding the overhead costs needed to run a political party, such as national and the regional convention and training program. During the election, the elite class particularly renewed their strong and undeniable ties to ensure the political protection, because parties are in the need of funds at the time of elections. South Asian experiences show that anti-reform lobby increases its influence when election brings out a hung parliament or a minority government or a coalition government. It is obvious that the leaders and the political party need money for the election campaign. However, since most developing countries lack state funding mechanisms for election campaign, political leaders and their parties have no other option than to renew their ties with the anti-reform elements to ensure necessary funds. Thus, with this process, the anti-reform vicious circle continues for years. Entrenched bureaucracy. This sort of resistance is seen when reforms try to limit discretionary power or the authority practiced by the bureaucracy. Major developing countries has experienced the bureaucratic resistance in governance reform. Like, they are less interested in empowering local government just because they don't want to lose their command and influence that they have been enjoying for years. They don't hardly support the civil service reforms intended to improve the state service delivery because they don't have enough competency to learn new things and to withstand the competition coming from the newer generation. They don't truly push for enforcing a transparent recruitment process in the civil service just because they fear that it will aid the practice of awarding public service jobs to their friends and relatives. They respond coolly to anti-corruption initiative because of their financial interest. However, bureaucratic reform will not be a major problem if the government has a strong public mandate for reforms and the strong leadership is in the power. But bureaucratic resistance can doom the whole reform process if a country is politically unstable and government is weak. Now the fourth factor of resistance is social group feeling excluded from reforms. In most developing countries, cities benefit more quickly than the rural area in the initial phase of reforms, as trickle-down effects from the center takes a longer time to reach the surrounding area. In this initial stage, when the rural masses see emerging income opportunities and rapidly changing lifestyle in the city area, they feel being ignored by the state and leading them to organize protests to vent out their frustration peacefully or sometimes even violently. This is the most crucial stage in the process of economic reforms, which can determine whether the country will move ahead in the path of further reforms or fold in the face of protest. In this stage, the local leaders, often aligned with the leftist party, emerge with a strong pro-rural slogans and condemnation of economic reforms to take advantage of rural frustrations and sentiments of being ignored by the state. In such situation, if such situation is not dealt with tactfully in time, it can emerge as one of the most strong resistances to the economic reforms. Now I'm going to talk about the ways of overcoming resistance to reforms. The first, introduction of broader political reforms. Broader political reforms which ensure appropriate representation of the communities and societies allow greater social participation in policy making and greater social inputs in government decisions is an effective way to overcome resistance. Broader political reforms open space for the civil societies, which also include business community, to play a role in the decision making process and force the government to listen what they are saying and formulate a consensus policy of reforms. Political reform will also ensure appropriate participation of the rural area in the formulation of national policies for the economic reforms. So, broader political reform provides greater political freedom and participation in the decision-making process, which creates broad-based ownership of reforms, which is a crucial factor for the sustainability of economic initiatives. Forming pro-reform alliance to educate people. It is the most powerful tool to overcome resistance to economic reforms. Reform-committed governments should tell the people what the country is losing and how the decades-long efforts of development has failed to produce result due to lack of reform. It should also tell the people that how state resources are being wasted and why investments that creates jobs for ordinary people are not coming in the absence of reform. It is important for the pro-reform government to constantly remind people of these points, possibly for years, because reform is a long and continuous process. In doing so, the government, media and the civil society can form an alliance for increased effectiveness of the advocacy. It is crucial that such pro-reform education also be extended to those who can shape the future political course of the country, like the leaders of the student unions, leaders of the trade unions and the teachers unions, among others. This sort of campaign will help to make people understand how reform is important for the country and creates demand for the reform-oriented agenda from the grassroots level, ultimately forcing the political party to adopt pro-reform policies and programs. So the initiation of economic reforms without first educating and convincing people of its necessity will most probably lead to a disaster. Educating people is the most powerful tool to ensure the success of reforms. Now the second point is redirect state resources to rural area. One of the effective ways to address the social group's feeling of being excluded from the reform is to invest heavily on the basic services like health, education and the rural infrastructure in the rural area. With the initiation of reforms, the government withdraws its hand from the major economic activities and through privatization and increased international aid, the government will have more resources to invest in the rural area. Reforms will have a twin impacts. First, it will improve service delivery in the education and health, and will also help people to feel the change that the reforms have brought to their village. The massive investment in the infrastructure in the rural area will create employment opportunity for the local people, which along with the income generation will increase their ownership on the development activities. And the most important caution that need to be taken while initiating reform is that reform initiatives should never be seen as something imposed from the government or from the outside. This is a common mistake that often occurs in the less developing countries, and as a result, people, including the government, to some extent, lack full ownership of the reform programs. This allow for the possibility that such reform programs can be reversed whenever there is an unfavorable political environment. Again, people should be told that the reforms are our need, not others. We need the reform to accelerate our development pace and to raise the quality of people, to raise the quality of the life of our people. Of course, people should be told that we are taking technical and the financial assistance from the abroad just because we don't have that capacity.